Good evening, and welcome to Monday Night Travel with Rick Steves Europe. My name is Emily Burks, and I am delighted to be your host this evening as we explore New Orleans through the eyes of some of its locals. Tonight, we will be hearing from 3 different locals who will be sharing what they love most about their hometown, some tips for discovering New Orleans back doors, and some of the surprising history behind some of New Orleans' most iconic offerings, from Mardi Gras parades to drive-through daiquiris. And now that that's out of the way, I am so excited to introduce our guide for the evening. It is the multi-talented Andrew Farrier. Andrew, welcome to Monday Night Travel.
Hey, appreciate the opportunity.
Well, I am so excited to have you here and for you to help us understand this city that I think is often very misunderstood. And you really are the perfect guide to do so, since you have lived in New Orleans for 20 years at this point. So I was wondering, what do you get up to down in the Big Easy? Can you tell us what projects you're working on? And yeah.
Yeah, it's a really easy city to wear a lot of different hats in. So, as you said, I've been here about 20 years, which I am more than 20 years old. So, I am what New Orleanians would call a local, not a native. I moved here a little bit before Hurricane Katrina, for anyone who's keeping count. And it is an easy city for sure to be a little bit of a bohemian, to do a lot of different things, as we will see from the other guests who are going to chime in this evening. But I came from a very small town in Louisiana, and if when you picture a small town in Louisiana, you imagine swamps and 19th century houses and quirky front yards with like homemade art in them, that's very much the kind of place that I came from. Add in a Japanese garden and a very famous prison, and you have the famously complex place that gave rise to me. So moving to New Orleans, both, coming from one kind of classic Southern tourism destination, as a lot of small towns are, to another one, and also coming from an artsy small town into an artsy small city, really natural transition. So in the 20 years I've been here, I've been doing a lot with the local tourism scene as well as the local film and television scene that I'm involved in sometimes. We have a very grassrootsy, low budget local theater scene that I've always enjoyed being a part of. And over the last few years, when those analog pursuits got a little tougher to do, I made some shift over into YouTube and some podcasting, and those digital things are how we met. So lucky me.
That is right. And I am looking forward to seeing some more of those artistic events that you've been involved in
Oh,
since
thanks.
since you've moved to New Orleans during our show tonight. But I was doing a little digging about you online in preparation for this show, and I came across a statement that you wrote that just really struck me. So, if I may, I quote, growing up in small town Louisiana, New Orleans was that city down the river, part eccentric neighbor, part cautionary tale, easy to judge, hard to understand. Since moving here in 2004, I've learned enough of its stories to understand one fundamental thing. It's a place where great hardship and great joy have always lived side by side. And I think what struck me so much about that was just all of the contrasts that seem to coexist in New Orleans. So I was wondering if you could elaborate a little more on that.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned a moment ago some of the reasons why a move from small town Louisiana to city Louisiana makes sense, but they are very different places in a lot of ways, and New Orleans is rife with contradictions. Uh, Part of it being, as far as hard to understand, easy to judge. I think everybody knows the New Orleans brand, and it's a blessing and a curse for us that basically everybody in the world knows that New Orleans is a 24/7 party inside of a museum. And the kind of thing that makes our flavor specific is like the museum is closed. You've snuck into the museum at night. No one is going to tell you what to do. There's no alarms on. You get to make your own rules, and you can enjoy the history if you want to. You can read the plaques if you want to, but it is first and foremost in everybody's hearts and minds a party. Now, that is a brand. And in the way that any brand does, it reveals some true things. There really is kind of a freedom to do what you want to here that is hard to find elsewhere. And there also are elements of the city that brand conceals. And in that way, it is very easy for places like the one I came from to look at this city and scold it, to do the thing of like, oh, I love to visit for an occasional binge, but I would never live there. Whereas actually being here, I think, I mean, in ways that we'll talk about tonight, there's a lot of creativity here around how to respond to just the enormous amount of hard stuff that the city has been through. And I could pull a million examples of hardship from New Orleans' history, but like maybe most obvious to people who are alive now is Hurricane Katrina. And actually, if I can go ahead and share some slides, I have an image that I think will speak to this beautifully. So
Please do.
let me really quickly get this going. And what y'all are going to see, and some folks will probably be familiar with this, but I will explain it for anyone who's not. So let me share my screen. Here we are. So beginning with this lovely landing page that y'all set up for us. Lots of previews of things to come in here. But what I wanted to share with y'all is this image, which if you're not familiar with these, this is what's called a Katrina cross. And that's I'm speaking specifically of the X with the markings in the middle of it. So this is from the side of a house in Mid-City, New Orleans, kind of a low-lying area, a bit off the touristic beaten path. And after Hurricane Katrina, which is a lot of y'all will know, flooded about 80% of the city, killed a couple thousand people, and for those who survived, made it a much harder place to live, including by gutting a lot of the housing stock. I mean, this was an enormous episode of hardship in just American life. And as houses were searched after the storm, markers like this were left on every single house that was searched by the National Guard and other organizations. And those marks tell the date, the people who did the search, and what they did or did not find. And of course, in the years that followed, a lot of these have been painted over, and people have also painted over the water lines on their houses, which you can see marked in this image by the New Orleans flag that's horizontal across the wall. You can just make out the word approximate underneath that. So the water was about that high on this building. And of course, painting over something like this is a very understandable reaction. But in this case, and in a lot of other cases, someone chose to make kind of a home monument out of it. And you can see in this, in the green, some alligators. You can see in the blue some mammals that I can't quite identify. But you can see in the black what we call a second line. There are people dancing with umbrellas. And this is a thing that we do on all manner of occasions, but folks are most likely to have heard of it as a jazz funeral, which is definitely an expression of joy in the midst of sad circumstances. And so using something like this to dig the joy out of a tough moment, I think New Orleans is a little bit uniquely qualified for this because we are a place where things are tough. There's no guarantee that tomorrow is going to be better than today. This idea of work hard today and everything's going to be better down the line, that doesn't follow through quite as much here. But I'd say we're a little better on average than a lot of the United States at just figuring out how to make the most of and enjoy the things that we do have. And this feels like a pretty strong indicator of that to me. Well, y'all, I figure no better place to start a little bit of a rundown of what this place is about than food, which is first and foremost among a lot of folks' connotations. And as a first impression, we have this incredible image, which anybody who has ever decided whether to wait in line at Café du Monde has gotten this view. So you have Café du Monde over here on the right, and you can see what is actually a very modest line for Café du Monde stretching off towards the left and right across the street, what we call one of the Pontalba buildings. So classic architecture of the quarter, and we'll talk about that stuff a little further along. But the food in this city is very deeply traditional in a lot of ways, as well as innovative. So we'll focus on the traditional first. Café du Monde, to me, is a great example of this way that New Orleans is sort of a stacking of multiple layers of historicness, that kind of party in the museum phenomenon where the present and the past are going on at the same time. So the way that Café du Monde demonstrates that is like obviously Café du Monde is a 21st century staple of tourist destinations. It's on every must-do list, but it's a business that's been running since 1862. It is located in the French Market, which is an institution from the late 1700s. And also the French Market is a continuation of a commercial function that's been going on for about 1,000 years. The site of the French market was an intercultural trading post going back. Archaeology is tough here, but as best we can tell, about 1,000 years. And the natural topography of the area is such that the Mississippi River and a natural ridge intersect and make this area around the French market a perfectly natural place for people to gather, even under flood conditions that make the area really hard to navigate. So you're looking at this kind of neon sign on top of an ancient ruin, sort of superimposition of layers. And of course, once you get in, like Café du Monde is about what you can get right now, which is the classic coffee and beignets. And these are steeped in history themselves. The coffee with chicory that is served at Café du Monde is a Civil War era institution. There were shortages of all kinds of supplies during the American Civil War. And so the supply of coffee that was very limited was stretched with the root of the chicory plant, which caused it to yield more. And so we have continued doing that since the Civil War because folks acquired a taste for it. As for the combination of coffee and beignets, the French market has been this commercial spot for a long time, like I mentioned, and coffee and beignets have long been sold, were sold before the Civil War by enslaved women on Sunday hours that they had to themselves. And even in some rare cases, we have evidence that there were people who were able to buy their own freedom. I mean, talk about working extremely hard for a better tomorrow. You have examples of that coffee and beignets facilitated. So even this breakfast destination that folks want to go to first thing in the morning, which like we who live here tend to think of it as late night pre-gaming rather than breakfast, but it's 24/7. You can do either one. It has these layers of history behind it that are super easy to miss and perfectly fine to miss, but there for enrichment if you want them. You'll also find if you visit Café Du Monde, a lot of the folks who work there are from our local Vietnamese crowd. We have a huge Vietnamese community here. And what's funny is you can find Café Du Monde coffee in Asian markets all over the United States. It's actually one of the easiest New Orleans products to find because it simulates the very, very strong dark coffee used in Vietnam more closely than a lot of the other stuff that's available in the US. So it is used across the country by Vietnamese transplants to the States to make stuff like Café Suda that you'll get at Vietnamese restaurants. So if you want to get some Café Du Monde coffee, you can order it, but you can also get it at your local Asian grocery store. And beyond things like coffee and beignets, we also have a lot of different foods that are a bit more seasonal. So right now I speak to you from Mardi Gras season when king cake, our seasonal pastry, is being served. And we also love a seafood boil. Here's a little bit of the process of making that. And you are looking at a shrimp boil in this case.
So, Andrew, I have heard that since the weather in New Orleans is so consistent that you guys actually mark the passage of time not by a change in the seasons or a change in weather, but by the foods that go in and out of season. Is that true?
It's a huge part of how we talk about time for sure. There's a, we talk about a lot of things. We have festival season, football season, hurricane season, crawfish season, kingfish season, parade season, like all of that stuff is in there. But they all intertwine, they all mean slightly different things. And yeah, if you are somebody who is visiting here and trying to make sense out of all of it, you kind of just have to constantly ask people what they mean. And knowing what's in season can be really tough. Crawfish is in season right now, and you just have to kind of do some research in advance or read up on events that are happening in town to see, oh, this brewery is hosting a crawfish boil. There must be a pretty good supply of crawfish right now. And for us, because it is so seasonal and because it comes during a time of year when we like to be outside, because our winter and our spring are really mild and pretty pleasant, we tend, and I have this is I'm not familiar with this fella here, but this is my dear sister and my niece. This is what crawfish eating looks like in Louisiana. You can get it at a restaurant. You absolutely can get a little tray of crawfish as a side dish to your bowl of gumbo or whatever. But for us, you eat it outside. And if you are not standing next to somebody picking up crawfish, peeling them by hand off of a table covered in newspaper, and having a conversation with a woman holding a baby about when you're going to go to the parade or how the Saints are doing this year, we often feel like you're not quite doing it right. And of course, that's the purist approach. And being a purist and being a tourist are not necessarily super compatible. But for y'all who might consider visiting during crawfish season, we do have at a lot of places like breweries crawfish boils that are open to the public. So you don't necessarily have to be in somebody's backyard to do this. You can find one of these events going on and show up and kind of figure out your way through it. There'll probably be some live music, and it's a great place to make friends with some strangers. So, highly recommend a crawfish boil if you're ever here in late winter, early spring, or just looking up events in New Orleans in general. And we'll certainly have a chance to talk more about that. So, I want to go over to the high end for a second because crawfish is very like down and dirty Louisiana food, but we also have kind of a storied tradition of fine dining, white tablecloth. Antoine's is in a category by itself. Antoine's is one of the oldest restaurants in the country. It is the oldest restaurant in New Orleans, easily from 1840, operating continuously. And it is still run by the fifth generation of the founding family. So going through this building is just a historical experience. It is a kind of architectural marvel. You have all these photos all throughout the building, which y'all can get a glimpse of in this still, with like, oh, here's Marlena Dietrich's signed portrait from when she passed through and had a meal. So it is really immersive to be in there, and they understand how this works. They understand how to sell history. So they, for example, like to give out this. So they invented a dish in 1889 called Oysters Rockefeller, which you can find other places than here, but only they know the original recipe. And whenever they serve it, they like to give you this card. And the card implies, and take this with a grain of salt, that they've been counting the number of times that they've made Oysters Rockefeller continually since 1889. And this card, which I got a few years ago, suggests that I just narrowly missed being order number 4 million. So a culinary experience is great, but like something like this to bring home, they know how to really drive home that sense of living history. And Antoine's is not alone in this category. Here's a view of folks y'all may know from Galatoire's. Galatoire's is one of the sort of sister restaurants, these classic old school white tablecloth places, more casual during the day. So you're seeing a big institution, their Friday lunch here. And Galatoire's and Antoine's are both what we would call Creole restaurants, which is a cuisine consisting of a lot of brown ooze that's really delicious.
So, Andrew, you mentioned Creole just
Yeah.
now. Can you explain the difference between Cajun and Creole for the uninitiated? I know that I personally get them a little mixed up.
It's so this is a thing that starts off simple and can become extremely complicated. Historically, these things are really distinct, but in the present, it's hard to pick them apart. And Creole in particular is a really complex term. You kind of have to ask somebody what they mean when they say it. But to take it from the beginning, so Creole in the 17 and 1800s was mainly a way, and even earlier than that in some colonial areas around us, it was a way of describing people who were born in Louisiana or whatever the colony in question was. And you get this word used in French and in Spanish for French and Spanish colonies, but it describes someone born in Louisiana, but of a non-indigenous stock. So indigenous people weren't Creole, and people who immigrated to Louisiana weren't Creole. If you were Creole, you kind of were of neither world entirely. Your family was from one side of the ocean, but your experience was from the other side of the ocean, and it meant you kind of never fit either place completely. So it's very much basically like second generation immigrant is what it means. And you can kind of from that imagine the definition as concerns food. So when you have the first generation of, say, Europeans and Africans ending up in Louisiana, one of the burdens of them coming to Louisiana was that they could never have their favorite food ever again in its proper true form. So imagining, for example, a Spaniard who misses paella, all they can really do is ask an enslaved West African cook who has never had paella to try to make it. And that person, of course, misses the food of where they came from. So they are trying to make something like Benachin, which they really miss. and also kind of make it a little bit like paella to suit this other person. And you don't have the ingredients to make either of those things. So you're using Louisiana stuff. And the mess that comes out is what we call jambalaya. And the first generation hated it. The second generation grew up on it and came to love it. So it becomes the food of your nostalgia. So Creole cuisine is the food of the new world that never would have met the needs of the old world crowd, but that was just right and that we still think is just right. So it's evolved a lot since then, but basically Creole food is this merger. It's a fusion cuisine, basically, of French, Spanish, West African, and indigenous food. And depending where you go, you're going to get different ratios of those things. Somewhere like Galatoire's is going to give you a kind of very French heavy version of that. Whereas if you go somewhere like the Treme Bar in the Treme, a neighborhood next door to the French Quarter, your gumbo might be served over potato salad. You're going to be getting a much more West African inflected, much more down to earth, much more blue collar version of the cuisine. And they're both right in different ways. So you actually can get a lot of different experiences with Creole cuisine by hitting up different restaurants that are all doing a genuine version of it, just coming from different backgrounds. So that's Creole. Cajun, whole different beast. So I'm going to show you, this is an establishment where you can get Cajun food in New Orleans, and they're kind of precious. There's really not a terrible lot of them, especially ones that Cajuns would say actually are serving Cajun food. So we can boil this down to geography for one thing. So Cajun, as you look at the word here, you can maybe a little bit get a sense of what it's supposed to mean, which is Acadian. The word Acadian, if you say it enough, gets smooshed down to Cajun. And Acadia is Eastern Canada, which was part of the French colonial world, just like Louisiana was. So your Acadians, when England took over Canada, got ousted from this land where they'd lived a very long time. And they bounced around, and a lot of them ended up in Louisiana, but generally not in New Orleans. They generally went to Southwest Louisiana, where their very similar food to what Creoles already did ended up merging with a little bit more indigenous flavor. So Cajun food tends to be spicier, and also with German farmers who were already out in that land ahead of them. So you'll see a lot of sausage in Cajun food as well. Those are the really easy tells. For someone who's kind of a culinary fan, it gets more complex. So, like a gumbo can absolutely be Cajun or Creole. And either way, you're going to have a French thickener, a roux, as the base of it. But if someone's doing it the more Creole way, they'll probably also use okra to thicken it. Okra is a heavy West African contribution. And even the word gumbo comes from a West African language's word for okra. So okra is essential on the Creole side to a lot of people. A Cajun gumbo is going to be thickened with filet, which is powdered sassafras leaves. That's more of an indigenous contribution. So those things are subtle. You're not necessarily going to know if something is Cajun or Creole when you eat it here, but it is worth knowing we're a Creole city. We import Cajun. We're trying to rep Louisiana for y'all in its entirety, but Cajun is our second language in that respect. And you kind of got to go where it comes from to get it. Give you some vibes. This is the environment that you're going to be getting Cajun food in most of the time. It's much more get it out of a case. Y'all can see the sign for LeBlanc's Cajun hot boudin back there. And that is a Cajun sausage with rice mixed into the meat. That is classic Cajun, loud and clear, no ambiguity there. I also want to highlight we are a city that loves our culinary traditions, but we also have a short attention span. So we love to try new things. This is on the right, Mr. B's Bistro, which is famous for barbecue shrimp, a chafalaya on the left, place that I love that does kind of a modern Cajun Southern menu, but Cajuns are generally kind of anti-tomato in their food, and you can see some tomatoes loud and clear. Neither of these things is really Cajun or Creole. We're a city that likes to keep inventing. We have more restaurants per capita than any city in the United States. You got to do something innovative to keep up sometimes. And that means enormous variety, enormous experimentation, and the old school stuff. We want it both ways, and we generally get to have our cake and eat it too. I'll say lastly, I know a lot of people who are big foodies tend to do your food preparation and your research through resources like Bon Appetit, or like what's a James Beard Award winner here? Those are great indexes to use, and you'll find some really cool stuff, but you're not going to find anything I've mentioned through those routes. These more old school traditional things just don't show up there. But you would find something like Turkey and the Wolf, which downscale, humble building, outdoor seating. This is our vibe. But this is like a sandwich shop that's kind of consciously paying tribute to these little side of the highway places that I would have seen growing up going between Louisiana and Mississippi. It's not super, super New Orleansy. It just happens to be here in a city that loves food and wants variety. So try that stuff, but look for some of the more old school stuff too.
Andrew, would you say that if you wanted to find those more old school places, who's a good person to ask? Are people okay with, trying to make friends, maybe at a bar, or you've been a tour guide before, like do you give out like your actual places that you like to eat, or do you like to keep them to yourself?
I do. I love to share this stuff because, okay, well, part of my philosophy is like, there's nothing that's not touristy. There's no such thing as untouristy. We're a tourist city. Everything has just a notch of presentation about it. There's different degrees of it, but if my aim were to like insulate something that I loved from like outsiders, I don't think that way, but I think if someone did think that way, that's a real hard policy to try to hold on to because people have been coming here and keeping the city afloat for a good long time. It's just how we operate. That said, people have very strong opinions here. And as general with opinions, take them with a little bit of doubt. Talk to strangers. It is a great way to learn stuff here, and people will 100% give you their recommendations. If you ask somebody's opinion in New Orleans, you will get it. They may not know when to shut up, they may just keep going, but I have a great time adding things to people's lists, crossing things off of people's lists. It's one of our great hobbies is talking about food.
I love it. I love it. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's press on into, I guess, another fundamental kind of consumption that we do. So, drinking, another thing that we are very, very famous for. And this is a view of Bourbon Street, which is a great place to start with a subject that's so iconically connected to there. So, what you're seeing here, I think it helps get across the idea that Bourbon Street, in a lot of people's minds, maybe has like a notch of class about it. I hear that expectation decently often. And of course, in the quarter, you have all these historic buildings and you have this beautiful ironwork. And on this sign, you have the promise of somebody making a mint julep. And I imagine you'd have a hard time telling the mint julep from the Jello shot at this particular venue. But there is an expectation, and to some degree, rightfully so, that you're going to be finding like classy cocktail bars on this street. We're a city that loves our classy cocktail bars. There's a lot of them in and around the French Quarter where you'll find really nice mixed drinks, bartenders who take their careers extremely seriously, and restaurants tend to have a signature cocktail menu. Bourbon is also home to Galatoire's that we saw, and here is a Galatoire's brandy milk punch, and you definitely cannot get this at most bars on Bourbon Street. This also often comes in the form of a bourbon milk punch. And, bourbon having the connotations that it does, people tend to associate bourbon with a little bit of la-ti-da. You could easily be forgiven for hearing the name Bourbon Street and thinking that it was going to be a little bit upscale. And actually, one of the amazing things about Bourbon Street is that the name and the apparent connection with bourbon, the liquor, is a complete coincidence. So Bourbon the street and Bourbon the drink have nothing directly to do with each other except that they're both named after the same thing. When Louisiana was much bigger and it encompassed Kentucky, it was owned by France, and France was run by the Bourbon Kings, which are still part of the royal scene in Europe today. And the Bourbons were in charge, so you named things after them. And it just so happened that a street in the French Quarter and a county in Kentucky both got named after the folks who were in charge. It also just so happened that each of those places became famous for alcohol, but it is a marvelous coincidence of history that those destinies were so similar. So, if we were to name Bourbon Street more honestly, we could call it Beer Boulevard or like Hand Grenade Highway or something like that. But it is much more a place to get a lot of beer, and we're big beer fans here, which we can get to, but also these very large, very sugary drinks that are for tourists on the one hand, but also are remarkably, some of them, beloved by locals. So, getting into a little bit of like cocktail history for a second. With the examples in front of us here, you have the Pim's Cup on the left, which is a very nice, refreshing cocktail. I'd put this in the same category as a brandy or bourbon milk punch. New Orleans has a lot of history with these kinds of drinks, and the Quarter in particular does, because the Quarter was a big destination during Prohibition. During Prohibition, the Quarter had a reputation for being a slum. It was unpoliced, and so you could get away with a lot here. And it also happened that during Prohibition, the quality of spirits was really low. So you needed to adulterate them with heavy tasting stuff, with cream and sugar and fruit juice in order to hide the low quality spirits that you were consuming. That brings about either the recipes or just the popularity of a lot of the drinks that we love in New Orleans today, including the Hurricane that you see here on the right. And the Hurricane happens to be one of these drinks that actually kind of traces cocktail history because it starts off being a pretty nice way. A couple of us were talking before the show, and it's very much like a Mai Tai. If you had a Mai Tai before, if you get a Hurricane at a nice bar, it is like a Mai Tai. But Bourbon Street over time saw a gradual change of its clientele. So it has this modest local clientele, big for local, but modest in the national scale clientele during Prohibition. But then it becomes a destination after World War II. So people are often surprised that the National World War II Museum is in New Orleans, but the reasoning for that, in part, there's a lot of reasons, but one reason is a good third of the US military passed through New Orleans during the war. It was a big point of embarkation. And for many people, the French Quarter was their last impression of safety and hospitality before they went off into the horrors of that war. And when they came back and lived out the rest of their lives, the French Quarter was sort of this time capsule of their innocence for the rest of their days. And it's really how the Quarter becomes the scale of tourist destination that it is now. So for these, think about the dads of the 50s into the 60s. These are people who were interested in respectability, but also had PTSD. So like massive amounts of alcohol, you wanted to start off dignified and plummet. That was the Bourbon Street brand for a long time. A next generation down that kind of zagged against that came in much greater numbers, came with a lot less money, and wanted to be undignified to start with. And that kind of tends to be how you get into these drinks in the plastic cups that are made from a mix in very, very high volume. So that's a little bit of the saga of the Hurricane and how we got to the Bourbon Street that we have now.
Wow. Well, speaking of the Bourbon Street that we have now, one thing that we haven't talked about yet is the famous hand grenades. And I am wondering, what's the origin story behind these? I would say, daiquiris are sort of an icon of New Orleans at this point. So where did it all start?
Yeah, I don't have an image of a hand grenade cup. If you've never seen one before, they're not unlike this thing that I'll show you here, but this is a an imitator drink called the cocktail, and basically when you get this more numerous, lower spending crowd coming to the city, the bar becomes less of an attraction than the drink is. People start wanting to buy drinks and walk with them, which Louisiana was pretty late to the kinds of liquor laws that are common now. We had a drinking age of 18 for a very long time, and drinking outside was semi-legal. So people did walk down Bourbon Street and just want to reach into a bar and grab something and carry it along. And you can imagine a novelty container like this would go a long way toward making that appealing. You wanted to make the drink recognizable. So huge novelty containers, whatever is in them. And really, no one talks about how a hand grenade tastes. It's how a hand grenade looks. And walk out on Bourbon Street on a Sunday morning, God forbid, and you were going to see a zillion hand grenade containers just ground to chips under the endless stomping of the Bourbon Street walkers. It is a real unmistakable color. There's this kind of semi-transparent yellow shard that you see everywhere in the Quarter. And once you've seen a few, you know what they are. The daiquiri that you asked about, this is fun. So what you're seeing in the background here, these frozen drink machines, kind of like a margarita, these are frozen daiquiris. Y'all invited me to drink on the job. I happen to have prepared a non-frozen daiquiri for myself to enjoy this evening. So this is another thing like the hurricane that's kind of crossed this massive divide. This is a Prohibition era drink. It's from like late 19th, early 20th century in Cuba, and it's real simple but crafty. It's like very precise ratios of stuff. And it's just rum, lime juice, and simple syrup. That's it. Ice, too, was a big innovation at the time, a big breakthrough in technology, but very popular among Prohibition era travelers going out on a cruise from New Orleans and wanting to celebrate by crossing into international waters by imbibing right away. So these would have been very much associated with and very popular in New Orleans in that time. But you get blended frozen drinks coming along right after, and where those huge blended frozen drinks that you can see behind in this image come from is college towns. So New Orleans, very famous for drinking. Louisiana in general has a pretty strong appetite for alcohol, and college towns have a lot less to do than New Orleans. And back when the drinking age here was 18 and passengers in a vehicle could legally drink, liquor stores in a little tiny town, or maybe just outside of a little tiny college town, could have a blender at the counter, and a college kid buying their fifth could then decide to get a frozen blended drink on the spot. They called them daiquiris, and they have become a staple of the New Orleans alcohol diet ever since. So, as much as it seems like the big sugary drinks are a thing for tourists, Louisianians actually love them, and you can buy them at drive-throughs to this day. There's kind of special legal language that says it's not an open container as long as there is not a straw protruding therefrom. So we've uh, we've basically made an accommodation to a little mom and pop industry that exists in our state. So cheers. I love these guys. Find these at a classy cocktail bar. Try one of those. See what you think. This is kind of the third in the triumvirate of things that everybody's looking for when they come here. And music is a great place to get into. I think people also often ask about food and about drink, which is I hear this question really often of like, how do I get off the beaten path? How do I get away from the touristy stuff? And I've already said I don't totally believe that such a thing exists, but you and I were discussing this previously, and the metaphor that came to me was spiciness. Where if someone says to me like, "Oh, I want spicy food," or "I don't want anything spicy," I have to ask follow-up questions and be like, what do you consider spicy? It's very much a personal palate kind of question. And I very much think of off the beaten path in the same way. So we can kind of take music with that in mind. Music and geography go together really closely. So, one, I should say, having drawn the Cajun Creole distinction, Cajun music is very much a thing. And it is actually kind of apart from jazz, the Louisiana music that gets heard outside of Louisiana the most. It's a little tough to find in New Orleans. It can be done, but I want to pay it proper homage. And accordions galore is one of the ways to pick out Cajun music. So, a little glimpse of that here. Bourbon Street is a street full of music. And what you're largely going to hear there is a lot of karaoke and classic rock cover bands. Classic rock has its place. A lot of early rock and roll history happens in the French Quarter. Fats Domino does his first recording in the French Quarter. So there's an appropriateness to it, but you are mostly going to hear songs you already know. What we're seeing right now is one of the exceptions, which is Fritzel's European Jazz Pub right on Bourbon Street, only plays traditional jazz. And in fact, there's very few venues in the city that only play traditional jazz. Also, when I say traditional jazz, I mean what people call Dixieland jazz sometimes, the very old school, kind of original genre of jazz that comes from New Orleans. So you can find it on Bourbon, but it tends to be drowned out by all that other stuff. However, if you go a half block off of Bourbon at a number of spots, you can find music venues that are going to have more of a local sound, like Preservation Hall. And Preservation Hall is a place that was founded specifically to continue employing jazz musicians at the time when they started having trouble finding work on Bourbon Street, which is a problem in like the 60s, 70s. So this is a tiny room. It's not much bigger than what you can see right now. It's mostly standing room. You wait in line. They don't serve drinks. You got to bring your own. It is a real basic experience, but the band's incredible. And you can get a really good 40 odd minutes of music out of this place if that's what you want. For more of a go to a bar, enjoy some food, sit down, or get up and dance with some local music, Frenchman Street is maybe more the scene. This is immediately outside of the French Quarter. You've got to go a little bit of distance, but it's within walking distance of anything in the quarter. And it's 2 blocks and change of just solid music venues. Almost everything is audible from the street, and you can do a survey and choose where you want to walk in. You got a brass band right here. We love funk in New Orleans. We also get a pretty good supply of like blues and soul and various other Cajun music sometimes, various other genres that we love that are a little bit less at the absolute heart of what New Orleans does. But great variety, quite traditional jazzy earlier in the day and very modern jazzy as you get later into the day. So Frenchman, a little spicy, like moderately spicy. And I want to highlight, we'll come back to this, but that going outside and getting live music is a great way to do it. In fact, with that in mind, we have some video to share with y'all, I believe, of the kind of music that you can just stumble into on the street pretty easily. Outdoor music is a great phenomenon here, and we have a few samples of that.
That's right. And if Andrew, if you can just click
Mhm.
stop share for me.
Got it.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so we do have some videos of some musicians, and I would love to hear your thoughts on them, Andrew.
Happy birthday to you. Well, happy birthday to you. Oh, happy birthday just keep getting better. Happy birthday to you.
June 4th. Yeah. Awesome. It's for you too then. Doreen Catchins, y'all. The pleasures of Royal Street. Better than any of us deserve. You're the best.
Okay, Andrew, what can you tell us about this lovely lady?
Man, I am doing her no service by showing y'all what it looks like for her to play Happy Birthday of all things, but I think it just kind of drives home how live, how like of the moment the experience is. She has an incredible repertoire of traditional jazz stuff, and she can also jazz the hell out of whatever's on the radio because people ask for that stuff. She also loves the Flintstones theme song and can rock it. But y'all can hear, like, she is one of the best clarinetists we have in town, and she plays outside on Royal Street, and that's heart of the quarter. It's like where the antique stores and a lot of the big fancy buildings are, and you can just stumble across her and hear her for free. They are not programmed by the city. They have just been playing at this spot outside, her and her family. You're seeing her husband and her daughter there for almost 40 years, actually, now that I think about it. And she's in demand around the world. She plays in front of the Louisiana Philharmonic sometimes. Like, this woman is a superstar, but you can get up close and personal with her because the French Quarter street music scene works. And as you can see, she's raised a family in it. Her daughter over there is not in the band anymore. She did it in high school, but like anything you do as a job on the weekends with your family gets old. So always found it kind of amazing how skilled she was and how over it she was at the same time. I think she's the only person I've ever seen play the drum with one hand and text with the other at the same time. And her husband, actually, Mr. Lawrence, who you see over there on the right, just passed away a few days ago. So truly like a lifetime in music. I'm not sure. I think we will probably be seeing them again out there really soon. But Doreen Catchins, Catchins like kitchens with an E. She has an incredible online presence. So if you want to hear more of her doing better songs than what I just showed you, you can definitely easily find that.
All right. And yeah, this is just such a cool experience in that it's so intimate. And, where else can you have this like really intimate exchange with such a world-class musician? So
Absolutely. And it's normal. Like, this is just
yeah.
what Royal Street is like. So a walk along Royal Street is such a treasure trove.
All right. Well, we have a couple more videos, so we'll press on.
You're the best, Mr.
I got a belated for you. I got a belated.
I don't mind a little sugar. I don't mind a little pain. There's one thing that I
I don't know when, so get that. Bottles open, get that. Whiskey flowing, put it in my good cafe.
Okay, Andrew. So this obviously has a little bit of a different sound than the last
Yeah.
video. Yeah, what can you tell us about this?
So I see this band popping up a bunch of different places, but this is a really lovely and not quite as common experience to run into a street band on Frenchman at night. So Frenchman is mostly an indoor music street, but you do have great moments like this when a brass band, or in this case, a band that a little bit defies classification, is gonna pop up. And man, I just like a 7 or 8 piece band is a really hard thing to support in most cases. And I think these guys are a great demonstration of the livelihood that's possible for a very hardworking and versatile and skilled musician in town, but definitely within reach in a way that very few places have to offer. So I think Rick took this, right?
Yes, this
Yeah.
is a Rick video.
Nice. And this is Frenchman Street. So anyone who knows Frenchman, on the glance around, you may have spotted the Snug Harbor, which is a super famous venue right next to this. But this abundance thing, I mean, it overflows. The French Quarter is a little bit less a place to find street music at night. So Frenchman would be a place where you'd find some apples to bob for. Head down that way once it gets dark.
All right, we have just one more video, so we'll move on. Okay, so clearly that last one looked a little bit more like a parade. What were we seeing there?
That was what we call a second line. So made reference to this when we saw the Katrina Cross image a little bit ago, but a second line, which again, the version of it folks tend to have heard of, is a jazz funeral. And it is something anybody can do. Like that was a wedding, and weddings do second lines in the French Quarter all the time. So truly, I mean, if you're here in a nice time of the year to be outside, you will see those multiple times a day. And weddings are a really common reason for it, but I see like bachelor and bachelorette parties do them. I see business conventions doing them. Um, for us, the funeral purpose is one of the reasons why we might do one, but we also do them to commemorate big occasions of various kinds. Some festivals will kick off with one, and definitely what they're maybe the best version of going to see one of these is there are what we are called social aid and pleasure clubs, which are just clubs that have been around a long time, often founded in like mutual need, establishing kind of insurance funds or burial funds or real like staples of survival, but that would also throw parties together and celebrate real big once every year and hire a band to escort them through their part of town. So those happen almost every Sunday. And there you see that version. I mean, this was some people walking, waving around hankies. You are going to see people with moves. You're going to see people kind of catch the spirit, classic Southern Baptist Church style, and fall down. You're going to see people climb up lampposts. Those can get pretty intense. And they're block parties, so people sell food and drinks all along the route. So many different versions of a second line. That's an entry level one. But man, if you see one in the French Quarter for the first time and you just run into it, it is so miraculous feeling. So those are great fun.
And so is there any etiquette around joining one? It sounds like if it's in the French Quarter, it's okay to hop in. What about, other neighborhoods?
Yeah, so they actually the name second line comes from the participatory element. We don't use this terminology much, but the idea of the first line, if you actually said that, would be the band and the people who organized the event. The second line, in theory, is the kind of clingers on and the people who jump in. Now, in practice, people who are doing this in the Quarter are kind of doing, what you do in New Orleans. They're not necessarily super aware of that level of it. And so if you see a second line going by and the people who are doing it aren't really dancing all that much, chances are you're seeing some people who are they're having a good time. If you stand next to them and you kind of boogie along with them, you might get invited in, but they won't necessarily understand what it means if you decide to jump in. They might feel like, what are you crashing our party for? Perfectly fine, but that's kind of the average touristic level of understanding of these things. If you go to a neighborhood second line, a social aid and pleasure club second line, then it is more common to just jump in and join. It's good to get the temperature of the room, see if other people are doing it, stay towards the back of it. Don't try to like jump in at the front and be right by the band and the people who are part of the club. There is an attitude sometimes in New Orleans of wanting to somewhat insulate neighborhood events like that from needing to be as presented for the eyes of outsiders. We love having people around, but that idea of like, I need to explain this to you can put people off sometimes. So I would say those are the ones where joining in is maybe in the cards, but watch and see, get a feel.
Mhm.
Opener of a festival, have at it, like all day. That's what those are for.
Wonderful. And I think you have a little bit to share up next about festivals. So I'd love
Yeah.
to hear a
So
little more.
with the image that we saw in mind, like festivals are such a great way to hotwire this, like get around all the kind of gatekeepers of having to pay a ticket at the door. Some festivals are free, some of them aren't, but once you're in, there's enormous variety. And we do festivals through a big chunk of the year. We refer to the spring between Mardi Gras and the end of April, beginning of May as festival season. Fall has them, summer and winter have a few, but spring is really where it's at. And they are these big, massive outdoor events with a ton of live music, often on multiple stages, and with vendors selling food and drinks, and often some other element besides. And they're themed around a particular food item or a particular genre of music. Most famous would be Jazz Fest, which I think is probably closer to most people's experience of a music festival, although it is in the city. So you can walk out of the festival grounds and have restaurants right around the corner. But something like French Quarter Fest, which is a big free event in the French Quarter that just sets up stages all over the neighborhood, massively popular, but free to attend, can really give you a feel for what we love about being outside during the spring. So I cannot recommend enough that if you're planning a trip to New Orleans, look at the event calendar. And I have suggested a couple of links, which I believe Lisa has shared, for ways of looking up what events are going on during your dates. It's a great way to get ideas and also a great way to get off the beaten path because many of these festivals happen outside of the French Quarter or anywhere near. They will bring you to the area that you have been imagining getting away to, the neighborhood where people live. That's where these festivals take place. So knowing that we are keeping y'all into the small hours of the night by now, I'll do a real quick run through of the ambiance that you'll see in the city via its buildings. Truly, like I may have seemed like I'm kind of trash talking the French Quarter somewhat, but one of the things that the French Quarter is, I like to restrain people's expectations of it in small ways, but one of the things that it is incredible at is it is a masterwork of building preservation. It's one of the best preserved historic neighborhoods in the world. And what you're seeing here, this actually is not a French Quarter building, but let's go to one that is one of the really rare examples of actual French era buildings. So we would call this a French colonial building. There's very few of them in the quarter or anywhere else in New Orleans at this point, and that's because of fires that happened in the 1700s. But this one is a museum that you could visit. It's been under renovation for quite a while, so it might not be open if you're visiting really soon, but it seems like they're close to opening again. So Madame John's Legacy. Outside of the quarter, we also have the Pitot House, and yes, we say Pitot. Sorry for any French speakers. This is another one that you can visit the inside of that is out in the Mid-City by St. John area. But most of what you will see in the French Quarter is what we would consider Spanish era buildings. Creole cottages are the staple working class building in the oldest parts of town. Pretty humble, as you can see, but the color palette is really fun. And when you take these up taller, you start to get the buildings that we call townhouses. Some of the lovely photos y'all have been seeing so far have really featured the variety we call American townhouses. Americans tended to bring with them, when they came into the city after the Louisiana Purchase, a lot more taste for exterior ostentation, things like cast iron railings, big decorated door frames, and also exposed brick. These are all big tells of American design. These are the buildings that tend to catch people's eyes and catch people's cameras while they're in town. So you'll see a lot of this stuff, but it is the intermingling of the tiny bit of French, a lot of Spanish colonial, and a whole lot of American era buildings that are based on them that gives the French Quarter its look. Now, one of the things that's incredible about New Orleans is that you have kind of preserved the boundary between the colonial era and the American era. Along Canal Street, which bounds the Quarter on one side, it's an enormously wide street, and on the opposite side of it from the French Quarter is the American part of the city, delineated from the Creole part by different street names and different addresses. So along here, you can see the streetcars, which roll to various destinations, but the green one that you can see on the left is the one that a lot of our visitors like to ride up St. Charles Avenue, which goes through the American side of town. And I cannot overstate like how different the American side is. It's Washington, D.C., basically. So when you look at this, you're looking at a government building from the 19th century that was our city hall well into the 20th and really shows how Americans took dominance of the city over time. As you keep riding, you get to the Garden District, and I don't know if y'all heard about this, but we had a big snow day recently. We had 6 inches of snow, which in New Orleans has not happened in 130 years. And so I have some snow pictures of Garden District houses, and you will not see them looking like this for a while to come. This is the Buckner Mansion, which, if anyone watched American Horror Story Coven, you know this house from it. This is the Robinson House, one of a great example of the big ostentation of these places. And a lot of what makes the area stand out is the green space around them. The nickname, the Garden District, really speaks to that. And really, even more so than the houses, sometimes what we really love is the trees, these live oaks that just, they can photobomb all day long for all we're concerned. We really love these guys. So those have been the Garden District, and this is right here is the Lower Garden District. If you keep riding up the streetcar deeper into the American sector, you get buildings like the Brown House. This is the largest house on St. Charles Avenue. You get a lot of other mansions and classical styles. You basically see a timeline of popular American architecture for the high end from the 1830s into the 20th century. It's a great street for kind of house watchers. We are also a pretty working class town, so you'll see a lot of stuff, shotgun houses in particular, that are more down to earth. You can see a lot of pride was taken in the design and often in the care of these houses. People maintain these very complex colorscapes. They decorate their homes on the outside. They have gardens they take a lot of care of, and they come in a lot of styles and often get very, very brightly colored with time. This is a bungalow shotgun house that has gotten a very modern paint job. So for house watchers, it's worth seeing the high end and the lower end. There's a lot of interesting visuals in both.
Well, thank you for that intro to New Orleans architecture lesson, Andrew. And I think up next, we do have a quick video from another local. So if I could just ask you to stop sharing your screen. Thank you. So yeah, we have another local contributor, and he is actually from our very own M&T community. It's Mr. Dennis Malloy. So Dennis is going to take us for a quick tour around City Park.
Hi, this is Dennis Malloy, New Orleans native and lifelong resident. Many people who visit the city go to the French Quarter and never leave. That's fine, but today we're going to take you on a trip via public transportation, this red streetcar, to a neighborhood where there's lots to see and do in City Park. Stay tuned. We have walked from the French Quarter right here to Canal Street, and we've downloaded a handy app called Laissez, which will identify routes and give you the estimated arrival time of buses and streetcars. It's just a short ride down to City Park. Now, where we're standing is Canal Street. It's the widest street in New Orleans, 171 feet wide. Many people ask, was there ever a canal on Canal Street? And the answer is no. One was planned in 1807, but never built. The city used to be connected by lots of canals and waterways. Today, the only major waterway left from that era is Bayou St. John, and we'll see that today. So we're at the end of the line and arrived at City Park. We're standing here on the neutral ground. Now, in every other city, that'd be known as a grassy median. But in New Orleans, back in the Louisiana Purchase days, Americans and French always were battling, and they declared the area on Canal Street to be a neutral ground where no fighting could be occurred. Today, every grassy median in the city is known as a neutral ground, even the one we're standing on here by Bayou St. John. The New Orleans Museum of Art was financed originally by a millionaire bachelor named Isaac Delgado. He was born in 1839 in Jamaica and moved to New Orleans at age 14 to help his uncle with the family sugarcane business. He donated $150,000 to finance the museum and started off with 400 pieces of art in 1911. Today, the museum boasts over 40,000 pieces and hosts exhibitions from around the world. One of the gems of the collection is his portrait of Estelle by Edgar Degas. Degas' mother and brothers lived in New Orleans, and he paid them a visit in 1872. Estelle was his favorite sister-in-law, married to his brother René, a cad and philanderer. Estelle was nearly blind, which makes this painting have a melancholy tone. And as Degas himself was failing in his sight at this time, which makes it all the more poignant. Adjacent to Noma is the sculpture garden, 11.5 acres with over 90 works by modern and contemporary artists like Henry Moore, Louise Bourgeois, and Maya Lin, among pines, live oaks, camellias, magnolias, and lagoons. And admission is always free. So after seeing so many sights, it's now time to think about lunch here in the neighborhood. Any suggestions? For mid-price, authentic French bistro fare, right down Esplanade is Café Degas, and the old Degas family home is nearby. For economical Middle Eastern fare, there is 1,000 Figs, a favorite of my friend and today's cameraman, Russell. Our ultimate choice is Parkway Bakery and Tavern, founded in 1911, the same year as the museum. Here they serve New Orleans classic poor boys, kind of like a hoagie or a submarine, but better. And you can't go wrong with anything on the menu. The two specialties here are the roast beef dressed all the way with tomato, lettuce, pickle, and mayo, or the fried shrimp. With all the art, culture, and beauty we've taken in today, you might have to try a little of both. As Rick Steves would say, oh, baby. This is Dennis Malloy and Russell Decker, saying we hope to see y'all in New Orleans real soon.
All right. Well, again, that was one of our lovely M&T community members, Dennis Malloy, and his video editor and cameraman, Russell Decker. And I just want to say thank you two so much for sharing a little piece of your hometown with us. It really touched me that you wanted to take us on that tour. So thank you. And Andrew, I think you, since we are on the topic of art, have some more art to show us before.
Yeah. By the way, Mr. Dennis, incredible. That is when someone actually says poor boy, that you know that is a born and raised New Orleanian. That is delightful to hear. So talking about different neighborhoods, we actually have a having just seen Mid-City a little bit, which you could reach via that red streetcar that y'all saw along Canal Street. Very briefly, to touch on another neighborhood that sort of rounds out the cultural equation. We've talked about the more Latin side of Creole. We've talked about American. That's the French Quarter and Uptown. The Treme is another neighborhood that, for people who are visiting with a bit more of a curiosity about where does this whole West African element come from, the Treme really speaks to it. And the caption you see on this mural says, "From Congo Square to everywhere." And that really describes it. So Congo Square, very simple spot. It's just this. It's this cobblestoned open space among some trees immediately outside the French Quarter in what's called Armstrong Park. And Armstrong Park obviously makes an allusion to Louis Armstrong and therefore to music and to jazz. And Congo Square is often called the birthplace of jazz. What it is very demonstrably is the place where enslaved people, when they had a Sunday off in colonial era, they would gather there and they would do both a marketplace. We've mentioned before the idea of enslaved women selling coffee and beignets. So extrapolate from that the things that were possible here. And also, this is the kind of token indication that you would see of what went on in this space. But to enlarge the image on there, drumming and dancing in West African performance styles would happen in this space. And in the United States, that's extremely unusual. Most West African performance in the context of enslavement had to turn into work songs and hymns, What you got here was just a direct copying over, and the rhythms, the practice of call and response, the participatory element of that, it all feeds into second lines, into traditional jazz, and into all the styles of music that we do. So Congo Square is actually a big destination for music festivals, and every Sunday afternoon, it is a place where drumming and dancing still take place to this day. So as far as the Treme is concerned, a lot of the activity there is just kind of street life. I find when I take pictures of time I've spent in the Treme, it tends to look like this. It's just the people and the atmosphere, but there are a few specific things that you can do. There's some really storied restaurants there. A place called Dookie Chase is the restaurant of Leah Chase, no longer with us, but she founded it and was the chef there for many, many, many years. And for those who have seen it, she's the kind of imaginative basis for Princess Tiana from Princess and the Frog. Also, music venues like Treme's mother-in-law, the Kermit's Treme mother-in-law lounge, which obviously a very artistic building and related to a locally famous musician called Ernie Cato, who you see depicted on the side of the building there. And also the Backstreet Cultural Museum, which houses a lot of what we call Mardi Gras Indian or black masking Indian suits. These are outfits made for use on Mardi Gras Day and on a few occasions besides. And we're getting a couple views here of one particular suit, and you can really see here both the big picture, the massive silhouette of this. It's actually kind of hard to imagine somebody wearing this. I'll show you what it looks like when someone does shortly. But you can see the space where a face would go, and then the really fine beadwork that is done on these suits on the right. And we're going to zoom in even closer. This castle, this is the attention to detail on these things, has a horse looking out of the drawbridge. So the men who do this, and it is largely men, some women do it as well, but it is remarkably a very like masculine coded art form in town. And these guys brag about how much time they spend sewing all night long. It's a very interesting superimposition of like blue collar butchness and crafting skills. And when they are in their full splendor, like it can be hard to even recognize there is a person inside. And these suits are massively heavy. These guys dance in them all day. They play tambourines. They have call and response music that they perform all day long. So Super Sunday, another important occasion, definitely worth seeing if these guys are doing something while you're around. On the right, you have the Northside Skull and Bone Gangs. These guys are also commemorated at the Backstreet Museum. Every Mardi Gras, they run through the Treme at about 5 in the morning, and they bang on doors and windows and scream into people's houses and wake everybody up for a lengthy Mardi Gras day. You can see the apron that says, "You next." The message is, have fun today, but don't have too much fun, or there will be consequences. Moving on from that, having talked a little bit about the West African context of the city, one of the things that results in, really indirectly, along with the atmosphere of all these old buildings, is a real connotation with the supernatural. And I'm not going to directly tell you any ghost stories or anything tonight, but I do want to comment a little bit on why these things are so strongly associated with us. And as you can see, a pretty strong argument is the presence of cemeteries where everything is above ground. The atmosphere of these really brings thoughts about death and about what we do with death, what we do to make it picturesque or to memorialize it to the fore. And you have here St. Louis Cemetery number 3, very frequently visited. Going to a cemetery is a really common part of a typical visitor itinerary. I don't think people think about death on most vacations. On a vacation here, it is par for the course. That's one reason, and these things have been attracting attention for a very long time. We've been burying above ground since the 1780s. Besides that, another view, a lot of very high quality statuary on these things. To the hardship that New Orleans has also dealt with, one reason we are always associated with ghost stories and with stories about closeness with death is we always have been very close to death. It's a place prone to disasters. And this is a little hard to see, but what you're looking at here is an engraving, an old woodcut of a cemetery view. And the fellow in the foreground is rowing a boat through this cemetery. The cemetery has flooded so badly that to deliver these caskets to the tombs where they're supposed to be buried, he has to use a boat to get to them. And so our attempts to beautify death have constantly in the past met with enormous obstacles of just the topography and the environment here. Talk about ways in which like human endeavor tends to get foiled. Ghost stories are a natural product of that. And of course, these things have happened more recently with, say, Hurricane Katrina and other floods since then. Floods here are a pretty common incident. I also add, and this is something close to my heart, this is my dear friend, Roby Gilmore, who's a childhood friend of mine. And voodoo and the presence of voodoo in New Orleans are a huge part of why people associate the supernatural with us. And voodoo is one of these things that everybody knows about, but nobody knows very much about because it is here and it is real. But what it is often takes people by surprise. And to deliver it very briefly, voodoo is a West African religion that survived the passing into slavery, but had to hide under camouflage. It had to pretend that it didn't exist or that it was a different religion in order to survive in a place that was hostile to it. And it often did that through camouflage. Out in Congo Square, it could disguise itself as just big dances. No one knows what we're doing. No one knows why these dances are happening. And these symbols that get drawn on the ground that are called veves, they stand for the various spirits in voodoo, which are very similar to Catholic saints. So what you'll see done with these historically is that they were typically drawn in dust and then they would just be kicked away when someone didn't want them seen anymore. Nowadays, Roby is somebody who, a little unconventionally for the voodoo community, has decided to be pretty open. Secrecy is a big part of the voodoo tradition, and he has decided to be much more public about his practice of it. And so he will occasionally draw veves in front of the house we live in. So I live with a voodoo priest. I can promise all of the stuff about doll stabbing and people exploding is far overstated. I've made him mad before, and I'm just fine. So more on that, you can visit Roby. We have links to his stuff online if you want to get to know it. There are a lot of voodoo shops in and around the French Quarter. I will say they're a mixed bag. And if you wanted to visit, this is one that's not open anymore, but it's a very easy one to stumble across when it was right on Bourbon Street. If you wanted to visit one that is owned and staffed by members of the religion, there's a place called Voodoo Authentica, which is actually a pretty great voodoo museum, even though that's not what it's meant to be. It explains itself quite well, and you'll find people who are used to having the conversations that all the questions that might be bubbling up in your mind, they've done it a million times. So great place to visit. And then finally, to put a couple of other subjects that are close, I know, to Rick's heart and to the hearts of some of his family, we have the subjects of art and the biggest expression of art in New Orleans, which is Mardi Gras. And I think we have some more substance to share from a friend of the show.
That is correct. We are super lucky to have a video by a New Orleans-based artist, Nicolina Tyler, to share with everyone. And she is essentially just giving us a window into her artistic New Orleans.
New Orleans. It isn't just a city. It's a living canvas where creativity flows through every street. Here, art isn't confined to galleries. It spills out onto the sidewalks, enhances neighborhoods, and weaves itself into the very fabric of daily life. Home to sculptors, painters, builders, costume makers, and artists of all kinds, the city thrives on the ingenuity of its creative community, making it a beacon for artistic expression. I'm Nicolina Tyler, an artist rooted in the Bywater neighborhood of New Orleans. My work has taken me around the world, creating public art and collaborating with diverse communities. But no matter where I go, I'm always drawn back to this special place. There is nowhere else like New Orleans. Strolling through Jackson Square, you'll find painters, musicians, and street performers sharing their craft, a tradition dating back to the Civil War era, enriching the French Quarter's cultural fabric. At night, the Frenchman Art Bazaar comes alive, a vibrant market where local artists showcase one-of-a-kind creations. New Orleans walls tell stories through striking murals by artists like Brandon B. Mike Odoms. His monumental works spark dialogue, challenge perspectives, and celebrate the city's unique identity. Collaborating with youth and communities, he transforms public spaces into shared experiences. Organizations like People for Public Art, founded by Monica Rose Kelly, ensure art remains accessible to all. Their Gumbo Botanica project united female artists and young creators in a mural honoring the city's rich diversity. Few traditions embody New Orleans' artistic spirit like Carnival. From January 6th onward, the city becomes a playground of endless creativity. While legendary crews craft extravagant floats, the black masking Indians take artistry to another level. Their suits aren't just costumes, they are wearable masterpieces. Each bead and feather is sewn with intention, telling stories of pride, resistance, and cultural preservation passed down for generations. New Orleans also loves to reinvent tradition. The Teat Rex Parade offers a playful twist, presenting shoebox-sized floats that humorously critique Mardi Gras' excess and grandeur. On Thanksgiving Day, the human horse races deliver a wildly creative, tongue-in-cheek nod to the city's equestrian history. And when the pandemic canceled Mardi Gras in 2021, New Orleans residents found a creative way to keep the festive spirit alive. They transformed their homes into stationary house floats, adorning them with vibrant decorations reminiscent of parade floats. The idea quickly gained momentum, with thousands of homes participating across the city, a tradition that continues to this day. In New Orleans, art is a participatory experience. At the Bywater Museum of Unnatural History, storytelling meets absurdity. Each December, a citywide diorama contest invites anyone to submit their creations. A celebratory event follows with a panel of judges, ridiculous prizes, and plenty of fanfare. And then there's the Music Box Village, an interactive art installation and performance venue in New Orleans. This unique space features over 16 artist-crafted musical houses, each designed to be played as an instrument. Visitors can engage with these installations, strumming the walls, playing the floors, and creating rhythms in the drum kitchen, all to loop together into collaborative melodies. Beyond its immersive installations, the Music Box Village hosts concerts, art markets, puppet shows, and performances where creativity knows no bounds. Art has the power to shift perspectives and transform the world around us. Lately, I have been bringing a dream to life. In the heart of the Bywater, just minutes from the French Quarter, the Emerald Door is more than my home. It is an evolving art project, a gathering space where creativity, music, and community intertwine. This sanctuary is designed to inspire, connect, and celebrate the essence of life itself. New Orleans is a city that creates, a city that invites you in, not just to see the art, but to be a part of it.
Okay. Well, I don't know about you, Andrew, but that video just made me smile. And I want to say a huge thank you to Nicolina and Co. for putting that together. And for everyone at home, if you would like to take a closer look at Nicolina's work and her art, you should be able to find a link to her websites in the chat. So thank you for dropping those in, Lisa. And Andrew, I know we need to be wrapping things up here. We got maybe a little too excited in the first half of this show, but I know that you partake in a lot of the events and festivals that Nicolina just mentioned. So I'd love to hear any commentary that you have to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think for anybody considering a trip, Mardi Gras or otherwise, I mean, the particular locations Nicolina mentioned are heavy on the Marigny and the Bywater neighborhoods, which are located very close to the French Quarter. And this would be a great starting point for, if this vibe appeals to you, if these visual aesthetics appeal to you, you have a lot of great ideas in here. Much of it is seasonal, but honestly, if you just did a crapshoot and decided randomly a date to come to New Orleans, there's about a 1 in 8 chance that you're going to end up in the city during Carnival. And if it's not Carnival, then it's maybe another holiday where we do a parade, not always necessarily the downscale DIY costume parades that you saw depicted in there. Sometimes it's a bigger kind of corporate sponsored float parade, but these aesthetics are out on display more or less at all times, just to different degrees. So the vibes that you've seen here, available any time of year to different degrees, and she's given you a lot of really great starting points.
Wonderful. And do you have any photos that you would like to
Yeah, sure. We can finish with a
just to
last
complete that?
few. So just to go quickly through some last points, we've got so one, the stuff that you've seen, a lot of this was, I know, things that Rick got to see firsthand, and this kind of atmosphere, the street art. This is an example of a very famous street art piece by that was a Banksy piece back there, and then lots of this kind of found material, very colorful vibe. If you're into this stuff, the reason New Orleans has so much of it is we're very connected with this Southern trend, not really a trend, but a pattern of self-taught art or folk art. We don't have a lot of art education in the Deep South. So you tend to see a lot of people who just find their own way into it and sort of invent it. Self-taught art tends to look kind of like this. It tends to be stuff that you found, stuff that's a little bit head scratching some of the time. Maybe it's kind of childish, maybe it's kind of grungy, maybe it addresses pretty dark subjects, maybe it does it with some whimsy. And that is just the stuff that we have to respond to. If you're going to do expression in the South, you're probably looking at a decent amount of hardship that you're responding to. And we consider this kind of thing to be art. This is a piece that is on display at our Katrina Museum, and this is from Hurricane Katrina. This is a barricade over somebody's door. I invite you to read. The part on the left kind of spells itself out. I want to meet this guy so hard. The part on the right, a little bit subtler. It's got a date right after Katrina up at the top, and it's a call for Mardi Gras to happen again, for Carnival to return. And you're seeing the names of some of this person's favorite parades over there. So there is, even in the midst of a lot of suffering, just like we talked about before, a lot of imagining of like, here are everything great might not come back, but here are the great things that we're going to do again. I'll leave this story for another time, but Mardi Gras is the real epitome and the real kind of pinnacle of all of these vibes. A Mardi Gras costume doesn't have to necessarily be something. You can just be pageantry. And we do a lot of costuming just out in the streets. Add a wig and you're done. That's all it needs to be necessarily. Participating is at all possible levels. The big float parades are the stuff that people tend to know the most about. And coming to these is typically most people's first experience of Mardi Gras or maybe of New Orleans at all. But those house floats that are such a new thing have really taken off. People do some incredible work with those. And smaller DIY parades that do sometimes make fun of the big uptown parades are really popular too. One of the uptown float parades is called the Crew of Bacchus. The Crew of Barcus is a dog parade that rolls through the French Quarter with dogs in costumes. Hard not to want to see that. And then we also have the Crew of Chewbacca's, which is a parade that I participate in, which does all manner of sci-fi and fantasy fandom, and I get to operate the giant puppet that's over on the right every several weeks before Mardi Gras, but once a year. And we get to be right up on top of our audience like that. So we get to scare people from up real close. The Crew of T-Rex that you saw a little bit of, T meaning little or cute in Cajun or Louisiana French. It's Crew of Little Rex. Rex is another one of the big parades, and all kinds of satire that comes out of that shoebox parade. And then people who just make bean mosaics as their thing. The Crew of Red Beans. Everybody's on foot for the most part, but they do these incredible detailed pieces that would never show up on a float. So it's all over the map. Mardi Gras Day has costume contests. You can be sort of Halloween-y like this, or you can just be pageantry. These are some folks who won a big group costume contest with some X-Men tribute last year. Out in Cajun country, Mardi Gras is beloved, and you have a tradition where guys dressed like this drink a ton, ride backwards on horses, and chase chickens, and end up very drunk and very muddy by the time the day is over. So even getting outside of New Orleans, if you feel like you've done Mardi Gras and you've seen it, there are many, many other pieces of it to get into. If you're going to participate in Mardi Gras, glitter your beard responsibly, and also if you're going to go to a Mardi Gras parade, you got to be ready for some throws. On the right, you can see me attending not a Mardi Gras parade, but a St. Patrick's Day parade when we throw vegetables. So I caught that cabbage and lots of green beads, as you can see. So drink moderately, one drink and maintain, because you need your hand-eye coordination to do well at these things. And finally, making a sign is a great way to attract attention if you want to attract throws at parades. This is my sister and brother-in-law who came to a parade with me some years ago, made some signs that very much date this photo to a specific time. And I got some great stuff. They got some of the decorated shoes that this particular parade is famous for. So just a little bit of advice about how to prepare if you ever were to decide to visit during Mardi Gras.
Well, thank you so much, Andrew. That was wonderful. And I just love all of the allusions to Bacchus and Bacchanalia in New Orleans. It really feels right there.
The
So,
god of wine has been brought back to life by far and away.
certainly. Okay, well, we do have a couple questions for you.
Yeah, please.
But real quickly, I do just want to shout out our sponsor for the evening, which is the Rick Steves Travel Forum. So, as you know, we don't get to step outside Europe quite as often since we are Rick Steves Europe. But obviously on shows like this, it's an opportunity for us to venture out. And in the Travel Forum, that is another place where you can find a lot of great information about destinations all over the world. So that is really an online community where travelers get to exchange, their experiences, their travel tips for free. And so all you need to do is sign up for an account at ricksteves.com/travel-forum, and you can connect with travelers from all over the world and just share your advice. All right, Andrew. So we do have a couple questions for you. And I would like to start with people were wondering in Dennis Malloy's video earlier, he mentioned that he was enjoying a po' boy. And I was wondering if you could explain exactly what that term means. I think people weren't sure if it meant poor boy. So what's going on with that?
Yeah, it's funny. Among my generation, at least, I never hear anybody who says poor boy anymore, but Dennis pronounced it that way. Members of my family pronounce it that way. Poor boy is the original term, but with certain people's accents, po is how it is intended to come out historically. So, where the term po' boy or poor boy comes from is the sandwich originated, believe it or not, as a roast beef sandwich. It doesn't feel super New Orleansy, but it was a working class get by food, and it was specifically something that was served and created during a streetcar strike. So streetcar workers at one point were striking and weren't making any money, and restaurants that wanted to support the striking workers, if one of these guys came in, they could feed them, and it was a program of feeding these guys for free. And so the kind of classic image is of one of them walking in, somebody on the line saying, "We've got a poor boy coming in," and you would give them what you had, which was bread and the kind of roast beef that you'd be putting on a lot of things, and just a lot of gravy, and that would just get slathered all over this bread. So a classic original po' boy is so simple. It is just the long kind of German take on French bread that is very popular here. And it's very thick and kind of napkin-y on the outside and very airy and soak it all up on the inside, and just roast beef. Nowadays, you get them dressed, which means you add various things to them, lettuce, tomato, etc. And you also can get them with a different protein. And somewhere like Parkway that we saw him go, they have a couple dozen different po' boy options on their menu. But the original roast beef, not a thing people super associate with New Orleans, but there it is.
Ah, thank you. It feels like there's a lot of myth and legend associated with with almost everything in New Orleans. So
Absolutely. No. Our history, our historical storytelling does always need to be taken as a little bit self-aggrandizing.
all right. Well, thank you for illuminating that for us. And I will ask just one more question.
Sure.
And I am curious, in your work with travelers, what have you found surprises them the most about your city?
Yeah. I think we've kind of indirectly alluded to this, but I think given the brand that we put out there, this party brand, I think the thing that surprises people the most is that it has a soul, that like there is some real essence here. And I don't know, I think there is a long, long pattern of people coming here for a trip and just being like, oh, this is right, and deciding to move here spontaneously. It is one of those legendary things alongside the possums through the ceiling at Snake and Jake's and the poor boys getting roast beef sandwiches. And I think the thread that makes that possible is that we are, I mean, to go back to the very beginning, we are a place where there's just been more practice in how to find some joy in the present, about how to take even, tough circumstances and make the most of them. And I think the latest wave of people that we've seen really, really click with us is people who have needed to rethink work and not necessarily have it be the defining feature of life. As American cities go, we're pretty good for that. So, all reasons to think about spending some time here. And the more you get out and explore a little more widely, which I imagine people who are watching your show tend to like it a little bit spicy. I think y'all will find a difference of flavor here that will be a welcome balm to the way things maybe normally work at home.
Well, I know at least you've convinced me that I need to plan a trip to New Orleans as soon as I can. And I also just want to say thank you so much for spending your Monday night with us, Andrew. It has been an absolute delight to work with you and get to hear more about your city this evening. So thank you.
Y'all have been so great to work with. It's a joy, and y'all keep watching this show. I am a converted fan. I will be here again very soon in the audience.
All right. Well, I will look forward to saying hi in the comments, and just thank you again, Andrew. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks, y'all. Back at ya.
Okay. Well, I also just want to quickly thank our other contributors this evening. So that would be Russell and Dennis and Nicolina and Co. Thank you so much for contributing to this show. And next week, Rick will actually be back on the show, and he will be joined by Bread for the World President Eugene Cho. And the two of them will be sharing an update on the fight to end hunger. You can register to join that live at ricksteves.com. And I would like to thank all of you for spending your Monday night with us. And until next time, happy travels.